Hi, and welcome to this video on cells. It turns out that cells are a really big deal in biological systems, and so we're going to spend a video talking about cells and how cells work. A lot of this stuff is probably review. You probably got it in middle school. You should have gotten it in middle school at least, but we wanted to go through it and just talk about it in case you didn't get it in middle school. So the key points that we'll be talking about in this video are why living systems are organized as cells, and then the different types of cells in very broad terms, and their major subcellular structures. And we'll go ahead and we'll drop another vocabulary term in right here. We call these subcellular structures organelles. It's like organs in your body, but they're smaller because they're in cells, so they're organelles. That's how they got their name. And then we're going to talk about how the organization of cells and the structure of cells allows for all of the properties that we find in living things. And again, probably a review, but if it's not, I'm glad you're here. So the idea that living things came from only pre-existing living things is called cell theory, and it was worked out in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s by a bunch of European male scientists. They looked at a bunch of living things under the microscope, right? And so the idea is that microscope technology advanced to the point where people could actually see cells. And then people discovered that every living thing was made out of cells, and parts of living things are made out of cells, and so on. And this is actually a relatively later drawing. I think this drawing is from 1900, showing onion cells. But the point is still the same. They drew these pictures, they looked at living things, and they came up with this idea of the cell theory. And a theory in science is a broad explanatory concept that has a mountain of evidence that supports it and has never been disproven, even though they've been looking at it for hundreds and hundreds of years in this case. When we use that term theory in the sciences, it's very privileged. It doesn't mean like, oh, it's just a theory. No, it's like a big deal thing. It's a unifying concept. And so cell theory is here, and you can see it. It's pretty basic. The idea that all living things are made out of cells, and all cells come from other cells, and that cells are the basic unit of living systems. You can be one cell, you can be 100 trillion cells, like you are, but regardless, you have to be at least one cell in order to be considered alive by at least essentialist earthbound definitions. When we look at cells, we really break them down into one big division. We have on one side of that division the prokaryotes, and on the other side the eukaryotes. And what I've done here is just shown them to scale. So you can see that prokaryotes are considerably smaller than eukaryotes. Prokaryote is approximately the size of the eukaryotic organelle known as the nucleus, and the size of that. But that's really not going to be very useful for us. So let's go ahead and let's blow up that prokaryotic cell so that we can kind of see what's going on inside of it. And we have there our prokaryotes and our eukaryotes. We'll talk about the divisions in eukaryotes a little bit later on, but these are representative diagrams of the two major types of eukaryotic cells. The major difference between these two types of cells is that inside of prokaryotes, there are no membrane-bound organelles. In other words, there's nothing inside of a prokaryotic cell that is surrounded by its own internal membrane. That's really the fundamental difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And we usually see that most notably in terms of the nucleus, right? There's no nucleus in a prokaryotic cell at all. You can see that the DNA, right? We can zoom in a little bit and you can see that the DNA is right here, and it's just loose inside of the cell. I mean, it's not actually really loose. It's tightly bound around proteins and other complexes inside of that cell. And it's localized in a region of the internal solution inside the cell called the cytoplasm. But it's got its DNA. That DNA is not in a nucleus. We've got a couple of other things going on in a prokaryotic cell as well. We have a cell membrane right here. It's this orange thing, right? So we have our cell membrane. So regardless of what type of cell you are, externally you do have a membrane separating your inside from your outside. Prokaryotic cells also have cell walls, and they have cytoplasm, which is this liquid inside of the cell, and they have ribosomes, which are these orange dots here. See if we can make that point right at one of them. There you go. Right, we got ribosomes. You can see there's quite a few ribosomes inside of this prokaryotic cell. So that's basically the ingredients inside of a prokaryotic cell. Again, if you were studying this at a higher level, you'd find that there were other things going on inside as well, but we're not going to get into that in this class. You should be relatively familiar with the purposes of these different structures, the ones that I pointed to here. If you're not, we will talk about them over the course of our time together. In particular, maybe the ribosome is new for you. Yeah, that's the organelle that's responsible for making proteins based on the sequence instructions that are in the DNA. But outside of that, we can see that there isn't a whole lot going on inside of these prokaryotic cells. It's not to say that they're simple. They're incredibly complex. There are millions of components inside of an E. coli cell, all working together. But they are less complex than eukaryotic cells because, of course, eukaryotic cells have many membrane-bound organelles inside of themselves. And you're not going to need to be familiar with so many of them, but you should have an understanding of a couple of them. So we have the nucleus right here. We have the cell membrane, of course, which we can see here. Eukaryotic cells have cytoplasm and they have ribosomes, which are actually shown a little bit differently in this diagram. The cytoplasm is shown here in light blue. I'm not even going to draw an arrow to it. And then these little blue dots on the nucleus and on the structure surrounding the nucleus are the ribosomes. There's a bunch of other structures that we're not really going to get into in this class. Something called the endoplasmic reticulum, something called the Golgi apparatus. But we are going to focus later on two other major organelles that we find inside of eukaryotic cells. And so in order to get a handle on those, let's go in and look at the difference between the two major types of eukaryotic cells. We break eukaryotic cells into animal-like and plant-like organization. That's sort of the main dividing line. Animal-like cells are really designed for what we would call heterotrophic nutrition. In other words, they're going to go out and they are going to eat other things. Hetero is a prefix that means different or other, and trophic here means feeding. So they're going to go out and eat food, yeah? They're going to eat food molecules in order to get their energy. Plant-like cells are adapted for autotrophic nutrition. The prefix auto means self, and so of course trophic means feeding, and so these are self-feeding. Yeah, they will make their own food, and we'll talk a lot more about how they do that over the course of our time together. But for the purposes of right now, we're going to focus on two organelles that are really important for this process. The first organelle we're going to focus on is the mitochondria. And so what I've done here is I've gone in and I've actually put some circles around mitochondria in both of these types of cells. It's interesting to note that both plant-like and animal-like cells have mitochondria. Mitochondria is where a process called aerobic cellular respiration happens, and that is the main way by which eukaryotic cells get their energy from the food that they eat. Even though plant-like cells make their own food, they still need to have mitochondria in order to take that food and get energy from it. The other major difference that we can see here in terms of organelles is the chloroplast. And so what I've done here in orange is I have circled the chloroplast that we can see in this plant-like cell. The chloroplast is the organelle where photosynthesis occurs. Photosynthesis is the process that plant-like eukaryotes will use to make their own food. So notice that only the plant-like cells have chloroplasts. The animal-like cells do not. You can see a couple of other major differences in these two cellular structures. Probably the main one that you can see is that the plant-like cell is got this box-like structure surrounding it, yeah? That box-like structure is called the cell wall, and I'll just write it on it right here. Prokaryotic cells had a cell wall too, if you go back and you look at that diagram. But the cell wall is giving a plant or a plant-like organism like an algae or something like that a structural support system. Plants don't have a skeletal system. Instead, this structural support surrounding each of their cells is what provides them with the support they need in order to be able to stand up. If you're at all dusty on these things and what they do, you definitely want to make sure that you get clarity on it as we move through this course, because you are going to be expected to know these structures and what they do, both on this slide and from the previous slide. In a preceding video, we talked about life processes and the things that happen in a living system that make that living system alive. I've gone ahead and listed them here because I just want to make the point that all of these life processes come about as a result of cellular processes. Cells are going to be the part of your body that are responsible for growing, and they're going to do that by transporting material into and out of themselves and other cells. They're going to be the part of your body that's responsible for all of the energy processing that you do, what we call your metabolism. That's going to be accomplished by various enzymes that are present inside of your cells, and various organelles like our mitochondria, for instance. Of course, cells are going to be responsible for reproduction through the process of cell division. That's how all cells come from pre-existing cells, and there are different types of cell division, but we don't need to worry about that right now. Cells are going to change. There's a cell cycle, which is the life cycle of a cell and the process that happens throughout it. Cells can also change over the course of their life as they respond to changes in their local environment. Cells can receive information and can act on that information. We'll talk about the ways in which they do it in at least a broad sense over the rest of this unit and throughout this course. But notice that every one of those life processes that we talked about is directly attributable to a cellular process. So that's it for this video. I hope it wasn't too painful for you to review these structures and the processes that we find inside of cells. You're definitely going to want to make sure that you can do these things at the end. You want to explain how cellular organization allows for the properties of life. You want to be able to compare and contrast the major types of cells that we see on the planet. And you want to be able to explain the functions of particular organelles, specifically the nucleus, the cell membrane, chloroplasts, mitochondria, and the cell wall, and how those organelles contribute to the properties of living systems. If you can do those things, you're doing great. If not, that's okay too. Take a moment here at the end of the video, pause it, write down any questions that you have so that you can get the help that you need. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.